All right, welcome to Trauma and Yoga. This is a brief introduction to a very large thing. It would probably take weeks or months to get this training, really to get into the nitty gritty of everything. So I just wanted to give you a brief overview so that if someone comes to your classroom who may be experiencing or had experienced some kind of trauma response, which is most human beings who are coming to yoga, then you will know or feel a little bit more comfortable with understanding just a smidgen of what they're going through, so you can create maybe a safer classroom for them. So I'm starting off and I want to talk about the overview of the central nervous system just really briefly, right? So the way that the central nervous system works is we have really the brain and the spinal cord and how everything moves along those spaces. We have learned about this extensively in 200-hour trainings, and we usually talk about it in the lens of the chakras and understanding how a chakra can become imbalanced by becoming overactive or underactive, usually from some traumatic event, which creates a samskara or an impression in the subconscious mind. And from that subconscious place pulls all the fascia to that area. It's almost like, I'll explain it further, but we hold a lot of tension in the spaces that are most affected by trauma, right? We hold the emotions in the body. And it's important to understand that we have all these nerve bundles, right, through the spine that are connected to the brain. And it directly corresponds with the chakras. So you have the cervical, you have the thoracic, the lumbar spine, and then you have the sacral and coccygeal, right? And like you go through each one, and these parts of the spine through nerves will connect to the different functions of the body. So we also learn this through the lens of the vayus. We have apana vayu, which is that downward flow of movement. We have samana vayu, which is sort of helping us to digest, right? We have vyana vayu that goes out to everything. Right, and it's just they've mapped out the nervous system so we can understand the kind of asana that we're going to give people, the kind of postures that we want to give people, the kinds of diets we want to give people, the kinds of meditation and pranayama practices we want to give people. All that's broken down in 200-hour training, but just moving forward so we can kind of understand a little bit deeper when we have some kind of trauma, when it relates to the way that we are grounded in the world, it can get locked up at the root. If we have some kind of sexual or relational trauma that's involved with sex or creativity, it can get stuck in the sacral chakra. If we have some kind of trauma that inhibits us from doing in some capacity or completing, it can get stuck in the solar plexus. If we have some kind of trauma with our core relationships and safety within relationships, it can get stuck in the heart. If we have some kind of trauma with our voice getting taken away, it can get stuck in the throat, right? And then these upper chakras are really being disconnected from the self. You see this more in the CTPSD cases, which is more complex forms of trauma, right? The hormones can get dysregulated. They can have pain throughout, but that's from the lens of yoga. And we could talk about this further more from the lens of, modern psychology. So what they'll say is when you are meeting some trauma, our nervous system will fly into a response to try and cope with that trauma. So this could be fight, which can come out as somebody being very aggressive. They want to fight off the thing that is making them feel unsafe. Flight is another, and further on we're going to get deeper into all these categories. Flight is when there's a trauma or something that makes you feel unsafe and you run away from it, and you try to avoid it at all costs. The next is freeze. These are two that aren't as widely discussed, or everyone's always saying fight or flight, but there's actually two more that you may not be aware of. So freeze is they shut down, they feel scared, they play possum, they can't do anything, they just shut down. And then the last one is fawn, or sometimes it's like people please or appease. So everything's sort of not true to what the person's experiencing. They're trying to please whoever's in the situation by lying, pretending, because they don't feel safe to be upfront with their feelings or their needs. So you'll see a lot of people moving through the world who are people pleasers, and they don't realize that it's actually a trauma response. They're trying to keep themselves safe by being disingenuine to themselves, apparently. So the nervous, just like the chakras, can either be overactive, underactive, or balanced. We can either have a regulated nervous system or a dysregulated nervous system. Right? So what does this mean? A regulated nervous system will look like you're moving through your regular day, right? And you're going to fluctuate between something stressful, and once you feel safe, you calm down. And then something stressful comes up again, and once you deal with it, you calm down, right? So this happens all day long. All day long. You can drive in the car, someone cuts you off, you stamp on the brakes, you realize you're safe, and then you calm down. Your kid falls down, you get stressed, you help them clean the boo-boo, then everything seems okay, and then you calm down, right? Your boss yells at you, you get stressed, and then you deal with whatever they were upset about, and then you calm down, right? So it's like this, a regulated nervous system it's not like the world just stops and you never feel stress, right? It can cope healthily with stress when it comes into your life, and you can go back to baseline, right? So you can kind of like regulate yourself. And you'll notice that this ability goes away at certain spots in our life naturally, like the toddler cannot self-regulate yet, right? They're like the majority of their brain is growing before their prefrontal cortex has grown, so they like can't self-regulate, so they co-regulate, which is what we're going to talk about later on, about creating a safe space in the classroom. All right, so they co-regulate. Another time is when you're a teenager, the same thing starts happening where your brain's growing at a capacity where maybe the prefrontal cortex can't come up. So it looks like impulsivity, aggression, sort of butting against whatever other people say, right? All that is a response to not being able to self-regulate. So the nervous system becomes dysregulated. What we're talking about here is what psychologists refer to it as is the window of tolerance. So it means the space between the stimulus and response where we can regulate ourselves easily. When somebody experiences a very deep trauma, they get pushed outside that window of tolerance, and then the nervous system becomes unable to self-regulate. So you get that dysregulated nervous system, right? So what happens is it goes so far past the ability to regulate itself that it almost gets stuck. So you can get stuck in a couple of different things. When it's overactive, it's stuck in being sort of like hyperactivated. It's very activated, like even if the stress goes away, they're still up and agitated as though there was something to fight, flight, fawn over, even if there's no present threat. So symptoms would be constant anxiety in the student. They're very easy to frustrate and anger, very easily become aggressive. They're restless and they get hyperactivity issues. Some people in the current sort of realm of psychology say that they're starting to think that maybe even ADD might be some kind of trauma response from early in life. You know, it changed. This is a theory, right? I'm not going to back it up or anything. It's just a theory to present to you that a lot of stuff that we sort of label as an illness or sickness can find its root in trauma, right? It leaves a deep impression, and that helps to sort of manifest the experience of the body and the mind moving forward through life. All right, so maybe they're overactive and they're having these symptoms, or maybe they become underactive, almost like the nervous system can't get up and go, right? So they could feel exhausted, depressed, lethargy, fatigue. So it could stay stuck in either overactive or underactive for a long time, or for some people it'll oscillate back and forth. And you usually see this with adrenal fatigue, which is associated with like extended trauma, right? The adrenals get exhausted, where they'll kind of like try to explode. They're so weak, they try to explode. And then they lose all their steam and they're back down to exhausted again, right? So they'll be super aggressive and then super exhausted, and they'll oscillate between that. And that's not a healthy or pleasant way to exist in life, right? That's sort of the opposite of equanimity, which is what we're always attempting to cultivate in our students, especially in the tradition that we learned in, which is the yoga and meditation of the Himalayan masters. So the whole thing is about learning equanimity, or being able to sort of reprogram your body and mind to be able to regulate itself healthily. So we do this through mastering the breath, cultivating an environment of safety for our students when they come into the classroom. This is a brief overview of what we're going to cover today. Widening the window of tolerance for them through the 8 limbs of the yoga practice. So we have the yamas, which are the inner observances, the niyamas, the outer observances, asana, which is physical poses, which are very, very healing for traumatized folks. We have asana, pranayama, which is breathwork practices that are very good at regulating the nervous system. Pratyahara, the ability to move inward. Dharana, the ability to concentrate on one thing at a time. Dhyana, meditation. And then eventually samadhi, which is that ability to really be equanimous and fully absorbed in whatever you're trying to put your mind upon, or sometimes enlightenment, they call it. And that's when all this stuff gets healed. So we have to deal with the inner samskaras, the inner impressions that the person got from when they were traumatized. We have to understand trauma in the context of sort of the physiology of the being and the mind of the being. We have to honor our traumatized student in a way that makes them feel safe, right? Safe relationships are healing for somebody who's been traumatized. So as the teacher, you have to present a very safe space for your traumatized students. And helping them to learn to complete the cycle of healing. A lot of people who experience trauma to the point where it dysregulates their nervous system, right? Their nervous system hasn't been given the opportunity to complete the cycle of healing, the cycle of processing, and the cycle of moving on. So they get stuck. So through the yoga practice, we help to teach them all of that. And we always try, especially for very traumatized people, we always try to do this in conjunction with a therapist, social worker, right? Real professionals who have been trained a very long time in this kind of thing. All you can help with is what you've been trained in, which is the lens of yoga, which is not the only way that we should be treating these people. They need to also be seeing a therapist. So make sure that you have access to some cards and contact information of really good therapists. If you need recommendations, I am always happy to make them. Okay, so the next is the neurobiology of trauma. So how does it get stored in our bodies? So what happens is we'll have this experience, right? And it's so overwhelming because we're not prepared for it and it's unexpected that the brain can't handle it. So it sends that ATP, it sends that information into the nervous system. And what you'll see when someone's enduring a traumatic situation is the nervous system reacting. They might start getting tremors. Like you'll see after someone's in a car accident, like they start shaking, they go into shock, right? They might break into a sweat, right? The nervous system starts reacting. And if it becomes too overwhelming for the nervous system, it's going to send it back to the brain. And the brain's going to say, no, I can't deal with this. And then it's going to send it off into the fascia. And wherever it ends up in the fascial layer, which is the layer of connective tissue in the body, it gets stored there. And it just sits and it waits for the conditions under which it can be expressed again. Because the body and the brain and the nervous system is always trying to work this trauma out, or the way that we learn in 200-hour teacher training is the samskaras are always trying to work themselves out, right? We use this example of like, once the impression has been set in the Play-Doh of the army man, we take the army man out, and our work is to try to like heal that area so it's back smooth the way it was before. It doesn't mean that we're losing our memories. It means that we're bringing the suppressed memories that have been stored in the fascial layer, where all the fascia is pulling to that space, which corresponds with whatever chakra is involved and whatever emotions were involved in the moment that they were experiencing, and it holds it there. So some people don't deal with their trauma, they stuff it down, they use their responses and their coping mechanisms. Some people will get eating disorders to try and cope with this stored trauma. Try to mute yourself, guys. And they'll deal with substance abuse issues, right? A lot of times we can say someone has, like, yes, there's this genetic component to alcoholism, but anytime somebody's trying to self-medicate, it often indicates to me as a teacher of yoga that they have endured some kind of deep trauma in their life that they're not processing. So they're using sort of Band-Aids to try and help themselves feel better. When a medical doctor recommends SSRIs to a patient without doing that in conjunction with talk therapy or other modalities, they can actually cause more harm than good to the patient. And it's something that happens, I won't get into that. It's one of my peeves about the Western medical system. I think that maybe only psychiatrists and psychologists should be able to offer that kind of medication, not regular MDs, because often it's offered without the other things that are so important to get to the root of what the problem is, and it can become another crutch for people, right? So you see people just trying to self-medicate with all this stuff on the surface. It's almost like they're trying to go over the hill to get to the other side of the mountain, but they don't understand they have to go through the mountain, right? So what we do in our yoga practice is we create a safe space for them to start to step into the tunnel, which is very frightening. And then we give them all the tools for them to confront the things that are hidden in the tunnel that they don't want to deal with, because it was just too much, right? And you should never have your students confront really deep traumatic things until they've developed all the skills that are needed to deal with those deep traumatic things. So we'll discuss that today, and it might be a review for some of you if you know about the Himalayan meditation tradition, because it really, really perfectly deals with all of this. So that's how it gets stored in the body. What is trauma? Trauma is an inability to experience the complete cycle of healing, right? That ability to go from the stress to the calm, to the stress to the calm. They get stuck. Not like a regulated system can keep going. They get dysregulated. So trauma happens when something is unexpected that we're not prepared to deal with, right? It'll come on quick. It'll come on unexpectedly. And it throws you off, and you don't have the tools to deal with it. So this is when the body starts taking over and tries to figure out how to keep you going, right? That's the body's job. We got to keep this thing alive. We have to keep it in some kind of homeostasis. We have to make sure it gets its needs met, getting food, safety, right? All that stuff. And usually not until those things are dealt with can we even apply, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we can't even apply those higher ideas of like dealing with our trauma, right? If you're like working paycheck to paycheck and you're trying to make money to feed your children and you're literally working all day and all night, it's not like you have the time to sit and deal with your problems. So the yoga is like a gateway for them to start to take little pieces of what happened and process it bit by bit, whether they know that consciously or not. We're setting the stage for that to happen for our students. So, yeah, they get stuck. And these traumatic situations or trauma can get broken down into three categories. We have acute, chronic, and complex. So acute trauma is the first one. It results from a single distressing event. This could be, trigger warning, close your ears for a minute if it's triggering to you, but it could be an accident, it could be a rape, it could be if you were assaulted. It could be from a natural disaster, right? People get trauma. It's very traumatizing if your whole house gets blown away, all your stuff, right? If the event is extreme enough to threaten the person's emotional or physical security, then it causes trauma. It creates a lasting samskara or impression in the person's mind. And, if it's not addressed, it affects the way they think and behave. It can present, these are the symptoms that come up. They'll have excessive anxiety and panic, irritation, aggression, and anger, an inability to sleep restfully, to focus, work, or study. They'll feel disconnected from their surroundings. And you see this in when people go through shock too, and it's just all connected. An unreasonable lack of trust of anything or anyone, and a lack of self-care or grooming. So the next is chronic trauma. It happens when trauma is going on for a long time, and it's distressing for a prolonged amount of time. So it could result from being sick a really long time. Right? People who work in hospitals might see this going on in their patients. It could deal from long-term sexual abuse, domestic violence, bullying that's going on for a long time in childhood or adulthood, exposure to extreme situations such as a war, right? Several events of acute trauma as well as untreated acute trauma may progress into chronic trauma. So the symptoms of chronic trauma often appear after a long time, even years after the event. As it starts to come to the surface, you'll become aware that that wasn't necessarily healthy, what you were going through. Especially as you start doing the self-work through yoga and contemplation, things may occur to you where you realize you're acting a certain way now that's not really helping you. It's actually harming you. When we disseminate, are these thoughts helpful or harmful? And we always try to get to the root of where did it come from? It usually came from chronic, prolonged stress that we just have to normalize it in our minds. Otherwise, how do we survive, right? Then we're out of those dangerous situations. We're in a healthier situation, and we're still trying to use all the coping mechanisms that we had to deal with those stressful times, but they no longer work in a healthy context. So when people sort of hit that phase of their life, they'll realize, oh, something's going on. What was the root of it? And that's when all the stuff starts coming up. So you can kind of re-experience that trauma years later if it's not dealt with. Some symptoms would be unpredictable emotional outbursts or anxiety, irritation, aggression and anger, fatigue, flashbacks, body aches, headaches, and nausea. You might have seen this in some friends and family or even yourself going through the past year and a half with the pandemic. This has caused a lot of chronic trauma for people. Right? It was just sort of an endless barrage of, death and sadness and stress for, hardship for a lot of people. So, we always see when students are coming in and they could be very aggressive to the front desk, very aggressive to the teacher, easily irritated by everything. That sort of indicates to me, and anyone who's been trained at the studio knows, if someone like that comes in, we try to co-regulate with them, right? We don't get agitated. We stay calm. We make eye contact. We let them know that they're safe here, that their concerns are heard, that we're going to take care of them, right? And that calms them down. And after a couple of months of practice, meditation, pranayama, all this stuff, they start to hit a space of deeper equanimity, and they always come back and apologize afterwards. But, you can't take that kind of stuff personally, because everything that people are behaving as is coming from what's going on inside of them. So we really have to have compassion for people who are showing up like this. And try to keep ourselves regulated as teachers. That's really, really important. And, a part of that means doing a lot of the healing work, of trauma healing work yourself, so that you can come to your students in a regulated state. So then and that's what we do in teacher training, right? So many people have a hard time in the middle because all of a sudden, all the stuff comes to the surface and you're like, whoa, I didn't even realize this was going on inside myself. But you learn the tools to deal with it, and it benefits you long term. But for your students who are just starting off on their path, we have to go slow, we have to be gentle, we have to really be understanding. All right, so then we have chronic trauma. Yeah. So actually the last one's supposed to be complex trauma. So this is a result of exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events or experiences. The events are generally within the context of an interpersonal, between people relationship. It gives the person a feeling of being trapped, complex trauma has very severe impacts on people's minds. It may be seen in individuals who have been victims of childhood abuse, neglect, domestic violence, family disputes, and other repetitive situations, even civil unrest for a long time in some countries. These people are growing up with that, and they're really, really affected by it. And it doesn't just affect the health or the mind. We know as yoga teachers that anything going on in the mind is going to manifest in the body, and it's going to manifest in your health and well-being. It's going to manifest in your relationships. It's going to manifest in your work, and it's going to manifest in the way that you learn. So it's really important that the stuff gets dealt with in a very loving, gentle way. So this is a toughie. This is the CTPSD. So for all of these people, the body, it already talks about this, the body sends the emotions to a place where it can stay until it's ready to be dealt with. So the energy of trauma is stored in our body's tissues, muscles, and the fascia. Until it can be released, the stored trauma typically leads to pain, uncomfortable body mechanics, and progressively erodes the body's health. So some ways that this can get stuck, the trauma can get stuck, right? The feelings, it can get stuck in your feelings. Emotions are the vehicles of the body, and the body relies on to find balance after trauma. Your feelings represent the accumulation of incomplete events and the body's attempt to complete them. By strengthening inner resources, we can process feelings, we can release stored traumas, and increase our ability to handle stress with greater ease. The next is protection. So when trauma occurs, our bodies activate a protective mechanism. A stressor that is too much for a person to handle overloads the nervous system, and it stops the trauma from getting processed. It's almost like an off switch so that you don't break, right? So it's not necessarily a bad thing this is happening. It's a protective mechanism. So the overhaul halts the body in its instinctive fight or flight response, causing the traumatic energy to be stored in the muscles, organs, and connective tissue. So whenever we store trauma in our tissue, our brain literally disconnects from that part of the body to block the experience. So what you'll see in students, like if I take someone into a pigeon pose and they'd stored some trauma in their hips, this is just a general example because a lot of people have felt this in pigeon, right? They've stored it in their hips, and I've guided them into deeply feeling where there's a lot of sensation and trying to feel beneath that. Where's the pain coming from? Which side of the body is it on? It'll take them into the feeling is so deep, the prana goes there, the energy goes there, that the memory gets triggered again, or the feelings of that memory get triggered again. So you'll have people sobbing on the mat, or some people will break out into laughter in certain postures, right? Whatever was sort of stuck becomes unstuck and rises back up to the surface. So, because the brain reconnects to that space. We don't realize how wherever there's pain, we're usually avoiding it, right? The brain is disconnected from there. It's interesting. So once you're not sending an abundance of prana to an area, it can't get very healthy, and it's going to have a lot of trouble healing itself. We need these spaces to be oxygenated. We need prana to be flowing freely for the body to work as it should. And when you meditate, even if you get into really deep meditations and you don't do the physical work of asana, in these deep meditations, you can feel into where there is tension. And literally, by just putting your mind there, that idea of dhyana, of absorbing your mind in that space, it helps to release it. So you'll get you'll be sitting in meditation and you'll get these memories coming up. Students say to me all the time, why am I getting these memories from when I'm 3 or when I'm 2 or I'm getting this crazy random memory. I wasn't even thinking of it. It just came up because that's the process, right? It has to come up in order to get fully processed to move out of your body and your brain, right? It's not like you're forgetting it, but if we're trying to get to the space of equanimity, which means a regulated nervous system, right? We have to go through the tunnel of it. It's not an easy journey, but it's a very worthy journey. So the predictable effect of stored trauma is degeneration and disease. You'll see the stress gets so bad in some people that they start getting autoimmune. right? It can be so profound for some people. And if they don't deal with it, you know, the symptoms keep getting worse and worse and worse because the body's trying to send you a signal, like, pay attention. Like, oh, you're having terrible pain in your lower back. Your body's saying, pay attention. I need you to process whatever you've been storing here. Pay attention to it, right? And then it will start to come up and you can process it and release it. All right. So the memory beyond the brain. So there's ample scientific evidence proving that memory storage in locations other than the brain are abound. So here are some cool examples. The immune system response is enhanced by T cells maintaining information about previous attacks by specific foreign antigens. The next is muscle memory improves the ability of sports stars and musicians to perform optimally even when they're under very extreme pressure situations. And also, I was just watching something about CRISPR technology the other day. This is just so fascinating. Genetic research has demonstrated that the matrix composing our body cell, DNA, possesses a complex information storage system. So what the CRISPR does is like a little space between the information. When you have a virus, or you're like trying to genetically modify something, it'll literally like take a chunk out, put the new genetic information in, because that's all viruses are. They're kind of like wandering RNA, right? They'll put the new information in and then they'll remember it. So anytime your body is encountering that thing again, they're going to mount an attack on it. The body has this incredible intelligence to help keep you going, to help you stand up, to help you succeed no matter what you encounter, and has this incredible capacity to heal. All right, so our muscles and fascia can hold memories. That's a part of this ability to thrive, right? Because it's giving you the time you need to deal with it, right? You deal with things, and that's the thing. Sometimes you've taken the time to deal with your own traumas, and you may see somebody else who's, you know, you can obviously see, like, oh, you're just doing this because of X, Y, Z, or like, this is definitely like just you're playing in the same sort of some scar over and over again, the same wheel of suffering. But until they're ready to deal with it, right, that's their time, right? It works on their time. We can't make it about our time. So especially as teachers, we have to be so patient with our students. All you can do is offer a space for them to work through it on their own or with a therapist, right? So 3 things are necessary to release your stored trauma. You need to have the inner resources to handle the experience that you did not have, right? You didn't have the resources, you didn't have the tool set to deal with the experience when it actually happened. So you have to establish those skills first, right? The second is you need the space for the traumatic energy to go when it's released. So if you're full of tension and stress, it doesn't allow for space for the trauma to move out of, right? So we're trying to do all the things in the 8 limbs to create sort of a lower stress situation. And, you know, a lot of this work can happen when you're on retreat or you're in like a special situation where you can just be quiet in your own mind. You're not in the hubbub of daily work and dealing with taking care of kids or dealing with taking care of your loved ones or whatever we get into. Having some quiet space to do it is really powerful, and it makes it an easier process. The next is the reconnection of the brain with the area of the body where the trauma is stored. So we do this through mindfulness practices. Yoga Nidra is super healing. This is one of the reasons, because we're, especially that rotation of consciousness at the beginning, you're feeling through all the parts of the body. A lot of our students where we can tell this person's experiencing trauma, you know, you can tell just from a phone call, because they're going to start telling you they might like go on repeat and you know, they just tell you all these things and they're just like, someone's here to listen to me finally, and they just unload and go and go and go and go and go. It feels like diarrhea of the mouth. You know, you can tell, oh, they have a trauma they're dealing with. I'm going to recommend to them restorative and yoga nidra, because that in itself will be so deeply healing to their nervous system. It'll create a lower stress environment so that all that stuff can come up. And then it's doing all these things, right? It's going to go put the mind, the attention where the trauma is stored. And I've seen people who just do restorative yoga and they find such a huge change in their body that you maybe wouldn't expect because you're just lying on the floor over bolsters and blocks, right? But it's actually creating an incredibly healing situation because it kind of hits all these, it gives the tools for all these things. So we combine all 8 limbs of the practice with therapy, and you can successfully bring those traumas to completion. Many types of verbal therapy are awesome for the development of a person's inner resources for handling a traumatic experience. We also give a lot of those resources with the way that we teach meditation. Yoga reduces stress and tension levels, so that makes space for the release. Meditation and pranayama are also really important. And then yoga asanas open the channels, help heal the channels of the body, help regulate the nervous system, right? Yoga is doing all the things to help with trauma. So let's talk a bit more about the 4 stress responses. I think this is important to kind of know about yourself and about your students. The first one is self-preservation at all costs. So they'll get a rise in adrenaline, have an explosive temper and outburst, become very aggressive. They have angry behavior. They can start to become controlling of others, even a bully. They can't hear others' point of view. They have a pronounced sense of entitlement. They demand perfection from others because they've really been traumatized into demanding that from themselves by some other person. And they have dictatorial tendencies, right? So if it's so very, 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 very extreme, it can come up as narcissism, sociopaths, and conduct disorders in the diagnostic manual for psychologists. The next one is flight. They can start to get sort of an obsessive or compulsive behavior that shows up. They can feel a lot of panic and anxiety. They may rush around a lot. It's almost like they're running away from the thing. Over worrying. They could be the workaholics. They can't sit still. They can't relax. They try to micromanage situations and other people. Always on the go and busy doing things. They want to be perfect. And an overachiever. This can be commonly called OCD when it's very, very extreme. Bipolar, ADHD, panic disorder, and a mood disorder. And the next is freeze. So those people might space out and might feel like life is unreal. They might go into hibernation mode where they can't do anything. They might isolate themselves from the outside world. They could become couch potatoes. They disassociate, which means they'll like literally black out. They don't know where they were, what they were doing. They can have brain fog, difficulty making decisions or acting on decisions. They get phobic of achieving too much because of the trauma that they've experienced. They want to hide from the world and they almost feel dead inside. So sometimes this can become so extreme that it's labeled as clinical depression, schizophrenia, ADD, and DID. The last one is to fawn, which is people pleasing. So they're scared to say what they really think. They often talk about the other person instead of talking about themselves and their own needs. They have very poor boundaries. They flatter others in an attempt to avoid conflict with them. So they try to make friends over like whatever in any way possible. They have a really hard time when people don't like them. They're like the angel of mercy. They overcare about everyone. They could easily become a sucker because people take advantage of how kind they are. They can't stand up for themselves or say no. They're easily exploited by others, hugely concerned with how they look to other people and their social standing and if they fit in or if they're accepted. And it could be a man, or they're like the yes man, the yes woman. Like they'll say yes even if it's going to destroy them. So this can be so extreme sometimes that it's labeled as codependent or victim behavior, victim mentality. So here's a little bit more about each personality. So for a fight, they have an unconscious belief that power and control can create safety, assuage abandonment, and secure love. Like if we look at the narcissist, they were probably dealing with somebody who's like this, and they had to become more powerful than that person in order to be safe. So they're often, their defense pattern is to pursue power and control. The contributing environment would be a kid who was given insufficient limits, right? They were never really given any sort of guidance to stop any kind of like healthy discipline, but they ended up imitating one of the parents who was a narcissist. Their approach to connect with other people is by controlling other people. Their approach to feel safe is by attacking or confrontation. They sort of look at relationships as like they're just prisoners. So they're very controlling. They have incessant monologuing, criticizing, and rage. They can be very, very assertive and bullying. Their decision-making tends to be impulsive. They avoid isolation. They don't like being alone with themselves. And they demand perfection. The next is flight. And their unconscious belief pattern that's creating the world that they're existing within is perfection and achievement will make me safe and lovable. And that's exhausting. So they tend to run. They tend to run from uncomfortable situations. So their defense survival pattern is to kind of escape into their thoughts, which can cause them to become obsessive, and their actions, which can cause them to have a compulsion, right? When you experience trauma, it feels like all your power is taken away. So a lot of these behaviors we develop are ways to get our power back. The childhood environment is probably hyperactive response to family trauma, ranging between the driven A student and the ADHD dropout running amok. So they kind of fluctuate from side to side. Their approach to connection is to withdraw by staying focused on their own personal performance. So these are the ghosters. These are the person who play the games, thinking like if I could just manipulate them enough by being distant, then they're going to love me. The approach to feeling safe is by achieving, by being the best, because then people will back off. They're a human doing. They tend to micromanage, they worry, they have performance anxiety, they can be adrenaline junkies and overachievers. They're efficient type A, overanalytical. They avoid inaction. Right? They got to get up and go, and they're compelled by perfectionism. Right? The next one is the freeze, which is people shutting down. They have an unconscious belief that people in general are a danger. So they avoid human contact as a way to protect themselves. The contributing environment in their childhood is they were the scapegoat. They were either blamed for everything or abandoned. They weren't allowed to fight, flight, or fawn, right? They couldn't, none of that would save them from the situation that they were in, so they shut down. So how they withdraw by avoiding people completely. They don't act on anything. They hide from the world. They stay detached. They might be hibernating, sleeping, daydreaming, TV, online browsing, and video games. It may fluctuate between peaceful and catatonia. They struggle to make a decision because nobody ever gave them the ability to do so. They avoid people in general, and they're very phobic to achievement. So the last one is fawn, or the people pleaser. Their unconscious belief is the price of admission to any relationship is the forfeiture of all my needs, rights, preferences, and boundaries. If I want to be loved, I have to give up all my ability to have any needs or boundaries. So the way they survived was by trying to please people. That's how they avoided any kind of drama or hurt. This tends to be, the contributing environment is a child of a narcissistic parent. They learn early that bits of safety and love can be earned by being a compliant servant of the parents. So the way they connect is by trying to merge themselves with people. It's almost like in relationships, they try to become exactly like you. And you might, as you're teaching for a long time, you might notice this in like relationships you've had, these different personality types, but you're going to notice it in your students in the way they sort of relate to you. And your job is to sort of create a safe space where they don't have to fly into these ingrained defense survival patterns. They're doing this to avoid dealing with the inner real trauma that's been stored inside of them. So the yoga space has to be a safe space. The relationship with teacher has to be a safe relationship where you don't need or want anything from your student. You're simply there to serve them. If you think about all these different personality types, they're all going to take that out on you as the teacher. You know, if you have like a deep relationship with them for a long time, and your job is to keep trying to co-regulate them enough that they can supersede those things. So the next is they try to connect by merging with people, right? Their inaction is really like going along with what everybody else is doing. Everyone's jumping off the bridge. I'm going to jump off the bridge too because I want to be accepted and loved. They try to keep others happy, and they tend to get exploited, and they let themselves get exploited because they think that's the way to being loved. They tend to be an entertainer, yes man, nice guy, high concern with fitting in, flattering others. They're very helpful, and they're always sort of like expressing the servitude. They defer to what others want to do. They avoid conflict at all costs. And they go for social perfectionism. So you can kind of understand how like the personality is developed. And this is all associated with the chakras as well. Right? You can see how if it's overactive or underactive, right? If we're holding the trauma in that space, and then we know what yoga poses to give to help them express and open up through those spaces. So, you know, you can kind of see what's going on in the student just by talking to them for a little bit, hearing about their relationships, hearing about what they're going through. And it makes a huge difference for what you want to offer them in a private setting or a group setting. Okay, so the skills that we're trying to help them learn on the path to equanimity or self-regulation is the first. This is everything from your meditation training. Okay, from the meditation training we give in teacher trainings from the Himalayan Yoga Masters. These are the steps to really be able to get equanimity enough to be able to meditate. These are also the steps to healing trauma. They all work together. They're very potent and very powerful. So the first is we have to teach them to be able to sit still and become aware, right? They have to feel comfortable enough to sit in one place with an erect spine and the shoulders back, right? If you're thinking it's the spine and the brain, we have to get it all aligned so prana can move up the central channel and heal and open those spaces for them. That's why meditation can be really intense. So all the stuff comes up to the top of the surface, right? The next is to regulate their breath because we know that regulates the nervous system. So through pranayama practices. And the idea is we do all the techniques that we learned in the meditation training. We do all the techniques until we gain the skill where we can snap our fingers and sit still. We can snap our fingers and regulate our breath. We can snap our fingers and relax the body. But the next is be able to observe that you are something separate from your thoughts. Observe many thoughts, observe one thought, observe streams of thoughts, right? And then start to discriminate. Is this a thought that's colored by addiction or aversion, right? Are we experiencing that aversion to things? Are we flighting or are we people pleasing, right? Or are we addicted to it and we're being very aggressive towards it, right? Are we fighting? You get what I'm getting at? So you look at the thoughts that are neutral, that aren't colored by addiction and aversion, those two polarities, and you start to favor those uncolored thoughts, those neutral thoughts. You spend more time with them to create new grooves in the brain. And eventually you do this so much that the brain starts to restructure itself to the point where it's strong enough to handle and have enough space to handle when you unlock the locked trauma in the body. When that rises up to the top, the brain is in a space where it can handle dealing with that, right? We talked about how if you're in a stressed state, when that stuff comes up, it's going to push it right back down. So when we do these practices, we favor the positive, we restructure the brain, now there's space, now the brain can deal with the older things, right? And that's when we start to process the deep samskaras, the deep impressions, the deep traumas. We don't dive right into those traumas if you can't breathe and regulate your nervous system in the minute that you're in. You don't dive into those deep traumas if you can't even sit still or become aware of the different parts of your body and you can't relax your body. We don't dive into those deep traumas until you can see that you're something separate from your thoughts and you could discriminate, is this thought from something that I'm addicted to that is back from my childhood, some kind of coping mechanism, or something I'm avoiding, which is back from my childhood. You know, we're like getting to the root of it, realizing what the systems were put in place to keep us functioning, and then we go deeper than that. And now we have all these new tools in place where once it comes up, it won't keep re-traumatizing us. Because if you're trying to deal with the traumas before you have the tools, you're going to keep re-traumatizing yourself over and over and over again. It can become chronic trauma. That's what, a lot of people can experience. So they don't want to deal with it because it's painful. There's no way out and there's no solution because they're not aware of these steps that we're taught in the yoga tradition. And we can help students so much in ways that they may not even be realizing that they're coming along this path to healing their traumas. So the last bit is, how do we create a safe classroom? So I'm just going to give, you can't be perfect here. You never know when something that you say, you can't speak perfectly, where you're not going to ever trigger anyone. It's just being alive can trigger somebody from the way that you look, like just the way that you are, because I'm a woman, it might trigger some guy who's taking my class because his girlfriend or his mother or his grandmother or somebody else who was a woman traumatized him, so it could be triggering, right? So you can't be perfect, but you can try your best to create a safe space because we want to help them heal the cycle, to find completion, right? Recovery from trauma is the process of the body finding balance and freeing itself from the constraints that it's held all the trauma up in. Right? All too often, like we were talking about earlier, the recovery process gets halted, and it keeps preventing the trauma from getting processed over and over again. So we tell them to feel where the pain is, feel beneath the pain. Which side is the pain on? You teach them to go right into it. And it takes them into autonomic memory, which is where suddenly you recall the traumatic event. You get big emotions, right? It's very intense when it comes to the surface. You have to make sure they have the tools. It's so important. I've reiterated that over the years a million times. You have to give people tools in their toolbox. And then when they have the tools, you take them through the journey there, right? And it helps them to complete the process. It'll help the pain release and the trauma release. So some things you can do. Adjust the lighting. When there are bright lights, we can get a bit more activated in the nervous system. When there are low lights, more warm colored lights, we can make them feel peaceful, right? If it's very, very dark, it can be triggered. Like if it's too dark that they can't see, they will feel fear. It can be triggering for them. So you have to find like the perfect lighting between and just asking your students what lighting is good, where they feel comfortable. That's a great way to do it. You want to consider privacy. So Emerson, who's a trauma-based yoga teacher, suggests windows covered. Like if the windows are open in the gym and there's people looking in, that could be sort of triggering for people because they feel open and exposed. Now, not every classroom that you're teaching in, you're going to be making trauma informed, right? It's just good to know this stuff in case you get someone who's very sensitive who comes in, or you have a private client that you can really control the environment with. So yeah, you can cover the windows so they can move inwardly, especially for those people who fawn. They have that people pleaser thing. They won't be focused inside feeling where they're feeling their feelings. They'll be focused on what do I look like to the other people in the room? What do I look like to the people who are looking into the room? Okay, so you want to have privacy. That makes them feel better. Your music can be very triggering. Make sure that it's calm sound. There shouldn't be any like breakup songs or like some songs. The lyrics are so aggressive and just ridiculous. You don't want to have that kind of music playing in the room. Ambient is usually good for them because it doesn't trigger memories. And then minimizing noise. This helps them to stay grounded in the present moment. If you get like a war veteran who got traumatized because they were in a bombing, having like exploding noises outside the room or things dropping or sudden noises is going to set them off. They're not going to feel like they can relax. They'll get flashbacks. It'll feel like the traumatic event is happening again, even though they can't really like check in with what's happening. They just feel terrible and they like can't be in the space. Some people will have such severe PTSD that they disassociate. Like they won't even be in the room with you anymore. They'll literally fly into the traumatic event, and it may be too intense for them. So it's not completely avoidable to have a nice, peaceful, quiet room, but just try your best. We had a teacher who dealt with a lot of this, and we would make sure there weren't other classes going on at the same time, because that would be very stressful for him. Made sure that the front desk was very quiet, because it would trigger. You want to create space for people to find their calm in the yoga studio. So making space for students, some people feel more comfortable facing the door or a window as a way to know who's entering or leaving the room. These might be things that you never think about, but somebody who's dealt with really severe trauma is constantly hyper vigilant. Right? They're always looking to see what's going on around them. So when they enter class, you talk with them, what feels most comfortable for you? And then you create the mat space. You want to be in the present moment yourself, because that's going to keep you regulated, and you want to help them learn how to experience the present moment too. Tell them to pause and get into their senses. What can you see? What can you taste? What can you feel? What can you hear? What can you smell? Right? Focus on what's happening here and now rather than on memories of the past. You want to remind yourself that in this moment, you're safe. Right? So you can do guided meditations or the rotation of consciousness. They need time to process situations. You can't rush people, or they might get triggered and agitated. Right? The knee-jerk response when you're experiencing a trauma may be to react right away or find ways to numb the feeling, conversely. So instead, you want to teach them to pause, to slow down, to reflect on what provoked the emotions, rather than finding ways to deflect them. Or you're helping them create new patterns of existing that will help them to heal, rather than drive the trauma deeper. Because what they'll do is they'll create situations and attract people where they're re-experiencing the trauma over and over again, because they get stuck in that cycle of suffering, right? They get those samskaras. It's really important to try your best in facilitating the space for them. Listening to the body, which is something that's like the credo of the studio. What physical cues do you notice in your body when you think about the traumatic? Like if something traumatic is coming up in memory, where do you feel it? What's happening to your breath? Is it rapid, shallow, deep, rhythmic? What areas of your body are becoming painful or tense? Like these are just cues you can give in any posture to help them, give them tools. So you can try a gentle yin practice with longer holds. Restorative is great too. Or they can have ecstatic dance parties. This is from Tiffany Cruikshank. She does yoga medicine. I just want to give a shout out for the suggestions. Releasing the feelings. You can give yourself permission to, or your students permission to feel, cry, yell, laugh, right? Whatever comes up. If they're having a home practice or a private practice, they can take a moment to write their feelings down, to draw something after class, paint their feelings on paper. You can go outside with them, do walking meditation to help them ground, to become present in the space and collect the thoughts. And so anyone in the class could have had trauma. You don't know what you might be triggering for them. So watch for the students who seem agitated or upset, and without calling attention to them, offer permission for them to pause or take a restorative pose. We usually offer that child's pose, right? But for some, child's pose might be triggering to them if they were attacked in a position like that. So, you want to give options to those people. They can lie on their backs or on their sides in fetal position, or whatever feels most safe for them. And also just asking students, do you want the door open or closed? Is the light dim enough, or do you want it a little bit brighter? What music do you like? It makes them feel like they're cared about, like someone's actually caring about their needs. Where people are just constantly fighting, to connect. Everybody wants to feel connected. That's just a human response. And when you experience trauma, you do all kinds of crazy things to try to connect to people that doesn't make them feel connected to you unless they're also traumatized, right? So you sort of break that cycle by stepping into their lives and saying, you matter. Your healing matters. You're important. You don't have to do anything to please me. You don't have to act any way. I'm here right now with you. We're both here, right? So that creates a sense of safety. Don't ask your students about their trauma histories. When they feel ready, they will tell you all about it. When they feel safe, it's all going to explode out of them onto you. All your job is to just listen, acknowledge, right? Just create a safe space for them to be heard, right? All you're really doing is you're saying, where do you feel, how do you feel safe? Is there anything that they want you to know that makes them feel unsafe that you can avoid, right? Those are the kinds of like basic questions that will make someone feel like, okay, I have a sense of control over the situation, because there's nothing worse than going to a class and you don't know what's going to happen to you. You don't know if someone's going to touch you wrong, or someone's going to be too close to you, or some like weird person's going to talk to you. And like, it can be very triggering for them to go into the public arena like that. They take all their coping mechanisms into the yoga studio, and your job is to help them, give them space to unbundle all that. Okay. And if they unload some really serious stuff, you have to say, I know this amazing person you should really talk to. They're this incredibly capable therapist. I think if you do yoga and you work with them, that, maybe some things will heal. You can process a bit more. With a traumatized person, we generally don't do hands-on. It could be super triggering to them. They might not feel comfortable setting a boundary with you because they have a fawn response. So they think they have to just take it, even though they feel like they want to die when someone touches them. So you should refrain from touching people if you can tell that they're like really traumatized. And you have to kind of be intuitive with this. Right? Eventually, if you know them a long time and you know what's going on with them and they've unloaded to you and you know what they feel safe with, then you can. So we don't discuss this generally with them, but you give the opt-in, opt-out. And I always make it where nobody else can see them but me. So like go into child's pose. If you don't want to be adjusted, roll the corner of your mat under. If you don't want to be adjusted, raise your hand. Nobody can see you but me. And I'm not judging you. You know what I mean? Because if nobody else in the class is raising their hand and they can see that, they might not tell you that they're not comfortable. They might not express that boundary. So that's one of the reasons why we do that with the studio. And they have the option to change their mind. If they decide halfway through the class they want to be adjusted, they can be adjusted. If they decide halfway through the class they change their mind, they don't want to be touched, that's fine. You're allowed to change your mind. And that might be like revolutionary for somebody who never thought that they could change their mind and create that kind of boundary for themselves. That your boundaries can change. And that's okay too. So normally we would walk around, right? We do hands-on adjustments and stuff, but for our traumatized population, you're going to stay on your mat. If you're walking around, it might make them feel vulnerable because they can't see where you are. They don't know what you're going to do, right? So you staying on your mat, demonstrating poses while you're describing them, it may make them feel a little bit safer. We encourage awareness and choice. We have to help them establish bodily autonomy. They are the purveyors of safety in their sphere. They choose who to let in and who to keep out, right? Traumatized people usually have a very hard time with bodily autonomy. They're either becoming aggressive or not making healthy boundaries at all, like no boundaries at all. So we have to give them their voices back by giving them permission, right? Use invitational language. If you'd like, begin rolling your neck slowly from side to side. As you do so, notice if there are any areas that feel a little tighter or there's a feeling of tugging or resistance. As you notice those areas, you might choose one to linger with. You can send your breath to that area to a spot, or maybe you can give it a long massage to help it release. When you've spent enough time in that spot, you can roll yourself a little bit more until you feel the next place you like to linger. Or I've taken classes with teachers who are very polite. They'll say, please, if you'd like to, step your foot to the top of the mat, or you can take this pose. Or, when I'm teaching, I have so many options. There's like 5 options for each pose, and I let people know you choose what feels right for your body. Only you know what feels safe for your body, and that gives them the sense of calm. Okay, I'm right here. I get to choose. I'm in charge. And you give them tools to ground themselves. If they start to feel triggered or disassociated, they can focus on their senses. What do you see in this moment? Do you feel your hand in this moment? Do you feel your pinky finger in this moment? Can you feel your breath against the upper lip? These things are so simple. They're so grounding for somebody who's getting triggered. So you can do 4 things they feel, 3 things they hear, 2 things they smell, and 1 thing they taste. This is also part of Yoga Nidra practice. We do this. So you can offer this towards the beginning of class to get them situated, or you can also offer it during the end of class or any time that they seem to be kind of getting agitated. And you're not a therapist. I mean, some of my teachers are therapists as well, and that's a great combination. But if you're not certified as a therapist, you're not a therapist. You should not be giving psychological advice or trying to be the therapist to this person. You're just a space for them to, listen to. You don't want to get sued or cause more trouble or more problems. Just speak to what you know about yoga. Always have somebody really good to recommend, right? Unless you have a degree in psychology, you don't want to be going into those deep places with them. So if someone's like particularly in crisis and they come before or after class seeking support that you aren't equipped to provide, you have to have those healthy boundaries to refer them. Our Psychology Today has a Find a Therapist tool in the area. And there are even online therapists now after the COVID pandemic. So there's really no reason why they can't get the help they need. And lastly, give yourself grace. There's no perfect way to make the ultimate trauma-informed classroom. You're not a failure if a student gets triggered. When they're dysregulated, they're going to get triggered by all kinds of things, everything and anything. So you're a human and you can't be sublimely perfect all the time. You're also going to have your feelings and you're going to have your days, and you just try your best. And connect them with outside resources. And then learn and grow. Try to do better from it, but don't hold on to it if you don't do perfect.